So it's an interesting space to be in. There's comadres and kin online who I feel your presence, who are going to be here, which I'm very glad about. There's people and kin who I know here, which I'm very glad about because it places me. Auntie Teresa has been here this morning, which is also very good. And then there are faces and people that I don't know. And so it's always like, okay, when I'm kind of engaging with something that, as Auntie would say, speaks truth understood from emergence from racialized Indigenous women truth. It's not all about pink fluffy clouds and sitting in circles, which we were talking about last night, Jean-Louise. And so, you know, there's uncertainty. So I will see where I go along with this and how far I kind of unravel certain things. But really, it is for my kin in relation. That's who it's for. And anyone else that wants to listen in and join us and unlearn a bit and remember, then that's beautiful too. I think two of the things I want to shatter a little bit today are innocence and abstraction, and the ways that both these play a role in the continuing negation of Indigenous life worlds and presence in the modern colonial university, and that how this is kind of foundational and not exceptional. And I also want to kind of play a bit with how this manifests as forms of thingification, codification, and abstraction. And I have two, and so we'll see how that goes as I will go through really. And so I have two images here. One is from Andean cosmology, and it's really signifying the world turned upside down. And it's kind of from Andean mythology. So I have part kind of Andean Chibchamusca lineage. And it's kind of imagining what it might be like and who might be the subjects and what might be the forms of relationality and what might be the modes of poeticizing life that are emergent when the world is turned upside down. And in this case, the university world is turned upside down. But of course, that can apply to the world of activism. That can apply to more broadly too. So I use this example because that's where we're sitting in and that's what you asked me to do. But we could do very similar examples from the world of climate justice or Palestinian solidarity in these lands, okay? And of course, that speaks to what you listened to and were participating in earlier. So the first one is by this image over there, if you can see it there, is, yeah, very beautiful. It's called by Adriana Herbas. And I'm going to just read in Spanish and then I might translate into English at the end. Las semillas desde Ucapacha han removido la tierra y han surcado los caminos para que corra el agua y con besos de indias han hecho florecer la tierra. Que el amor entre mujeres nos nutra la vida, la historia y la rebeldía. And the second one I'll come back to, but that brings Auntie Teresa with us too. So in this talk, I begin from this seemingly banal non-encounter about a tea bag. In a staff room, and we can imagine this is metaphorical or real, in which the logics of white possession in feminine form, as in a white bourgeois woman, felt the right and the duty to pathologize and police the racialized indigenous feminized non-subject who was questioned and disallowed access to said tea bag as property and who quietly left said room in feeling the razor sharp border of racial profiling in her body and self and left. And arguably in this non-encounter, of which there are many all the time, metaphorically, this example person and people, in which the coloniality of being is reproduced through a suspicion and negation of legitimate being, in which the interrogation that Maldonado Torres talks about is always met, or the racialized subject or non-being is always met with, is suspicion, right? Are you not like us? And in this case, the denial of the tea bag and the being told off for taking what was property and not rightfully theirs really manifests and embodies the directive, you are not like us. So in this talk, I want to really unravel that a little bit using two kind of different frameworks that I was looking at and thinking that would be nice here. So the first is Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. This idea that the reproduction and the complicities of the frontier and the genocidal, which I'm arguing is foundational to the project of the modern colonial university, is often reproduced not in shark form. It's not the obvious monstrous, right? It's often this innocuous diligence, which Hannah Arendt talked about, which is both terribly and terrifyingly normal, in which annihilation, so we can understand annihilation and the genocidal is not fiendish or monstrous. It is instead impersonal and abstract, a matter of following rules, obeying orders, arranging schedules, embodying the juridical right of property as manifest in the university space. And the other one I want to combine this with is Fanon's work around anti-Blackness, when he also in, what's it called? White skins, black mask, white skins, the other way around, whatever. Yeah. Talks about a young boy who sees him, and he says, "Mama, look, a negro. I'm scared. He's going to eat me." And the mama said to Fanon, "Oh, he doesn't realize that you're as civilized as we are." So I'm going to use those two to say something more about this non-encounter of the tea bag. But then I also want to add the kind of work that we build on as decolonial feminists that really adds in the affirmative. So we are not merely erased and exiled out of the staff room because we have been negated the right to have the cup of tea. We also already and always have embodied in the cracks and the margins survivance and other modes of knowing being, other onto-epistemologies, other political economies of gift, other logics of hospitality, right? So there isn't kind of undercommons, I guess you might say. And so I really want to kind of move beyond Arendt, who in many ways is still bound by the logic of the modern colonial state and subjectivity, as she returns back to this kind of moral subject of humanness. And then also kind of play and move beyond Fanon, actually, because Fanon very much is focused often how he is read is in the rupture of legitimate appearance as legitimate violence, but not necessarily as affirmative present. So I'll return to the tea bag. So this kind of example, this lovely tea that I'm actually drinking tea from the staff room. I managed to liberate the tea today and a glass, which they might come and check my bags as I leave. And so, you know, okay, I left there and I'm like, literally, what the fuck is that? Like, what the fuck is that? Like, what the fuck am I being policed? What? Hang on. It's a bloody tea bag that belonged to some conference that I wasn't part of. And then I could be legitimate asked, you're stealing that tea bag, aren't you? And you're not allowed to take that tea bag, right? So, of course, I really wanted to say that. And I did say that to some folk. I don't know if some folk, oh, actually, it's not me. I maybe had said that to some folk in this imaginary example, right? And so, but of course, if I had said that in that encounter, you can imagine what would have happened. Yeah, you can imagine it right now. Some of you are nodding, it's for you. Yeah, those who are nodding. So obviously, I would have been met, or the person, any of us who experienced this profiling and this non-recognition, would have been met with further non-recognition and policing and pathologizing. Yeah. And that could well have resulted in security being called, in police being called, in further exclusions, yeah, which often does happen, as we know. So we must really work here and sit with this idea of Arendt, even with the limitations of her work, around the banality of evil, the banality of the genocidal, because I know that your group, of those who I don't know, you are part of the Geographers for Palestine, right? So you're really pushing for the anti-genocidal in your praxis. But of course, the feminized whiteness who intervened upon me, obviously, I would imagine, felt that she was dutifully playing her role as a professional subject with responsibilities in the modern colonial bureaucracy of the university, and would have been embodying her responsibility, her official responsibility. And this would not, it would have bothered her or them more if they had not obeyed the rules. They would have felt they were not being responsible to the right and the just. And so in this space, the quality of the monstrous becomes the mundane conditions of being knowing, in which the rightful presence of a racialized subject is negated and seen as pathological, a liar, a thief maybe, somehow doing wrong outside of the legitimate responsibility and juridical right of the modern colonial university. And in that act, it was like you must clear up the mess and the messiness, this messiness that leaks, you know. We're sharing tea bags now. What will happen when we share tea bags? One is both in this sense produced as abstraction. Yeah, there must be an abstraction. There must be just a cardboard cutout of the being facing them, right? Which is then labeled very, very rapidly with all these characteristics in that momentary non-encounter. But one is also, if we think about it, one also must necessarily then reproduce oneself as abstraction too. Which made me think of Fanon's point about in dehumanizing me, you also in some sense dehumanize yourself. But of course, this non-recognition takes on a particular layering when we feminize it, because there is a long genealogy which also begins as part of the emergence of the modern colonial city, urban, of the university as its lettered city pinnacle of reason and rationality, of these complex gendered and gendering bordering practices between white bourgeois women and racialized and feminized non-women, in which, as Gloria Wecker, who's based in the Netherlands, described, we are dealing here with a toxic heritage, the epistemic violence of a colonial discourse in which white people have silently and self-evidently assigned themselves a normative and superior position. And we know that as part of that genealogy, the racialized mother has often been the central target of this, because often the racialized mother in Indigenous and other life worlds is central to the transfer of intergenerational knowledges, to healing, to the possibilities of the reproduction of life. And we know how this manifests. And if you don't know how this manifests, you need to. And so this underside of dehumanization and gratuitous violence through interventions that seek to save the brown woman, often from the monstrous brown man, or from her unenlightened and irrational self, and reproduce a discourse of pathology and less than humanness. And the layering of this feminized subjectivity is also bound through innocence and tears. So if I'd said, fuck off, who the fuck do you think you're bloody denying me the tea bag? Which you'll feel why that actually has another layer of importance, which somebody else who's akin to me reminded me about, because I'm the tea lady, right? We would have been met with the tears and the innocence. And such white innocence, as Salem describes, implies being colorblind, seeing the self as ethical and moral, and importantly, positing the self as non-racist, perhaps even anti-racist, all the while actively engaging in racialized projects of domination. This willful innocence is also epistemological, right? Because, again, and this is where abstraction, I want to share a bit more abstraction and innocence, relies on the Black, brown, Indigenous woman as abstraction. That allows, and I do put it as bourgeois women, allows white with bourgeois women and bourgeois subjectivities, and their systems to think about racialized women in ways that are disconnected from the realities and humanity and wisdoms of our lives. This, of course, both reflects and perpetuates our thingification, an objection from the realm of the human, to which so many traditions like the decolonial feminists, the Black feminists, we talk about that as flesh, as non-being, right? As ungendering, as the non-mother there. And there are many different ways that, you know, you might connect to this. And such thingification manifests in ongoing non-recognition of her, as me, of us, as a subject at all, and active biopolitical regimes of power to eradicate her. These logics and rationalities are epistemological, because in that moment of negation of legitimate presence and pathologization, you may be a thief, you are definitely not like us, you must get out, is not merely the negation of the racialized woman's physical presence as body, but her reduction to flesh, in which she is denied the possibility of the capacity to gift, which is also from Maldonado Torres, he develops this in his Coloniality of Being, to bring anything to the dialogue of humanity and humanness, and rather she can legitimately be intervened upon to be corrected, pathologized, and or rejected from the halls of reason and modernity. As Moreton Robinson explains, in academic institutions where patriarchal whiteness is pervasive, race privilege blinds white feminist academics, and this is expanding, but this wasn't necessarily a white feminist academic, to their racial embodiment. There is no imperative to acknowledge, own, and change their complicity in racial domination. Such willful innocence and ignorance of political difference enacts the erasure of the possibility that we exist onto-epistemologically differently, or that we have the capacity to think for ourselves, which of course is a mode that legitimizes ongoing genocidal erasure and extinction. These onto-epistemologics of the frontier are reproduced, normalised, excused, legitimised, and refused in such intimacies of the everyday within the university. And you can put other organisations in here, state forms of organisation, you know, forms of social movement too. So the negation through dispossession, theft, and enslavement, and of Indigenous and racialised women's epistemological centrality in Indigenous and Southern political difference plays, and always has played, a pivotal role in this geopolitical project of the modern colonial university, and takes these complex gendered, classed, and raced forms. In the contours of my disciplinarity, which are embedded in logics, rationalities, interventions, and policy matrix, bound by the logics of the modern colonial state form and its subjectivities, which get mirrored in the disciplinary containments and confines and pathologicalizing practices, which are the foundation of political studies, international relations, and of course is bound by logics of Indigenous disavowal and anti-Blackness. And of course we can, you know, there's many ways we could go with T. So I could have also gone off with, you know, logics of colonization with tea and tea bag movements. So, you know, I invite you to do that around the tea. But I don't want to stop here, right? So Bell Hooks talks about this, and I often quote her because I think it's spot on, is that, you know, it is not enough to resist through refusal and through mapping the coordinates of this non-being and this disavowal, right? We must sketch and embody, I'd say, in flesh, alternative logics, right, of knowing, being, doing. And so as racialized Indigenous women, we survive, and we continue to weave other onto-epistemological epistemologies in the cracks and the margins, and obviously in the parallels, in the mangroves with Auntie Teresa, of this no place of global designs, anti-Blackness and Indigenous disavowal. And T, actually, and this is where, you know, one of my kin was like, but T has such a role. So T and plant kin actually play a really central role in this refusals. In these pedagogies of hospitality that they invite. So often in a lot of, and me in relation, right? In a lot of the kind of pedagogical practice that we engage with in this space and outside, hospitality and gift and circle with plant kin is actually really a big part of that. So part of my remembering and honoring and returning connection to the fragments of the rajaduras of my own lineages, Indigenous and Eastern European and Celtic, and then my relations here, has actually been through reconnection with the plant kin. And of course, plant kin really are great because they, they fuck borders, right? I mean, they fly across borders. They're little seeds, and they think this is actually very good. So they move. So they're necessarily diasporic too. So they're necessarily beyond the boundaries of nation state forms of identity. So there's a lot in them. But they are hospitality. So often, there's folks sitting here who did Indigenous politics this semester with me. We have tea, but we have tea when we're talking about political economies of consent. Because we consensually create together through the different herbs and the energies that they bring and the ancestral knowledges they bring in the classroom, a different kind of space of listening, of connection, of responsibility, of shattering the things we need to shatter, and of rebuilding and repiecing together those relations that we maybe need to build together. And then this made me think, so I bumped into Auntie this morning. And I've worked with Auntie now for a number of years. And one of the things that she'll often give me when I'm not very well is old man weed. And so I asked her this morning, could I talk about this? I'm going to talk about this. So this is another picture. This is the old man weed. So this is a painting by Cynthia Bucks, who is a Wiradjuri Yorta woman. And so old man weed is a herb. And it's a herb that, she was saying has been eradicated from here because of the way that the mangroves and that land has been erased and disavowed, and the modes of knowledge making that have justified the construction of the kind of urban city that we are on now and the kinds of buildings that we're sitting in now. Yeah? But they would always call it from Yorta land. So her mum's Yorta, mom's here too. And I think she talked about her mum this morning. Yorta land, so she's here. Yorta land, and she'd bring down because it's still growing there. So there are these political economies of gift too. And there are these other modes, often hidden and invisible to the gaze of colonial modern power, forms of social reproduction, forms of care, forms of connection, forms of kinship, forms of political economy. So, when we bring in the plant kin, a whole array of possibilities otherwise also opens up. And of course, when we work with the plant kin, we are also in relation to the knowledges that they bring about healing, about connection, and you talked about healing. So about healing from these rajaduras, or these traumas that crisscross our lives, or the traumas from the ongoing racial bloody profiling, right? The ongoing ways that the colony is in the epistemological intimacies of the urban place, of the university place, of the doctors, of the hospital, of the school system, yeah? So, the plants bring us a whole entrance into another world of knowledge making, of communal knowledge making. And I noticed that in this Palestine liberation geography business, very nice, that you cite Kisikanki, who's the Bolivian, who actually this Andean. And, she talks a lot, and I really relate to this a lot. The communal. So the plants bring to us this idea of the communal forms of knowledge making, but communal forms of knowledge making that are also ontological, going the other way around now, because they help us come back into being and mend those tears, and bring together that sense of dignity and presence that, maybe I would say fuck off in the room, or maybe not, I just go and we talk about it and we make meaning and we continue to weave the kinds of other onto-epistemologies that we do anyway. And that in doing this, we play with registers of visibility and invisibility, and we play with registers of voice and silence. These things, these other in the margins, relationalities, political economies, epistemologies, ontologies, rememberings, responsibilities are not always visible to white sight, but there's a reason to that. And we often don't speak them because it's not safe, which is why I was kind of nervous coming in. So, I know some of you, I don't know some of you, I don't know. I still don't know, But it's like sometimes one does that because you feel into the space of a relation. But yeah, there's this whole play. And so what I hope that I've begun to do with this, bringing this here, is to shatter innocence a little bit and abstraction and build on this idea of placeness that you've been building on through the morning, I think, and, you know, bring visibility to these epistemological violence of this non-encounter, making to some extent some communal sense of these logics and rationalities at play, but also foregrounding our ongoing onto epistemological presence, in which we enflesh this refusal of the negation of our right to drink tea. And in which we invite a praxis of sanctuary. What we create in our little spaces is a sanctuary amidst violation, and which we honour as well the racialised and Indigenous women's authority as co-creators of other projects of education as life-making. And so I just want to end, because this is something that came to me as I was writing these notes up this morning. I guess the invitation then to all of you in the differential ways that this has touched you, you've related to this, you haven't related to this, is, so what does it demand of us in differential ways, this knowledge, these truth makings, this visibility? How do we embody and enflesh the anti-genocidal in our everyday banalities of reproducing or contesting or decolonizing the modern colonial university and ourselves in relation? So I'll end with Adriana's words in English now. Las semillas emerge from Uquipacha, a Quechua word that refers to the underworlds in Andean cosmology. They have shifted the earth and furrowed the paths so that the water can run, and with their kiss, Las Indias have made the earth flourish. May love between women nurture life, history, and rebellion.